The year is 1951. Iran, a nation long coveted for its strategic location and vast oil reserves, teeters on the brink of chaos. Amidst this backdrop of uncertainty, a charismatic and fiercely independent leader emerged, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh, a staunch nationalist, channeled the growing resentment towards foreign control, particularly over Iran's most valuable resource, its oil. He railed against the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British-owned enterprise that had long held a monopoly over Iranian oil production and reaped the lion's share of its profits. The Iranian parliament, swept away by Mossadegh's impassioned speeches and popular support, voted overwhelmingly to nationalize the AIOC in March 1951. This bold move sent shockwaves through the Western world, particularly in Great Britain and the United States, where it was seen as a dangerous precedent. Mossadegh's popularity soared after the nationalization of the AIOC. He became a symbol of defiance against Western imperialism, a champion of Iranian self-determination. Crowds gathered to hear his fiery speeches, chanting slogans against foreign interference. However, Mossadegh's actions had also made him a target. The British government, furious over the loss of its Iranian oil assets, sought to undermine his government. They imposed an oil embargo on Iran, hoping to cripple its economy and force Mossadegh to back down. The United States, initially hesitant to intervene directly, viewed the situation in Iran with growing concern. The Cold War was at its peak, and the Eisenhower administration feared that Mossadegh's nationalist policies would push Iran into the Soviet sphere of influence. The specter of communism loomed large over American foreign policy in the early 1950s. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's iron grip, had consolidated its control over Eastern Europe and was actively supporting communist movements worldwide. In this context, Iran's strategic importance became even more pronounced. Situated on the southern border of the Soviet Union, Iran possessed vast oil reserves that fueled the economies of Western Europe. The Eisenhower administration feared that if Mossadegh's government were to fall, Iran could become a Soviet satellite state, giving Moscow control over its oil and a strategic foothold in the Middle East. The United States, eager to maintain its global hegemony, viewed this trend with suspicion, seeing it as a challenge to its interests and a potential breeding ground for communist influence. The British, smarting from the loss of their Iranian oil assets and increasingly frustrated with Mossadegh's defiance, began to lobby the United States for a joint operation to remove him from power. Initially, the Truman administration resisted the British overtures. However, with the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower as president in 1952, the tide began to turn. Eisenhower, a staunch Cold Warrior, shared the British concerns about Mossadegh's government. He also brought with him a new administration, including his brother, John Foster Dulles, as Secretary of State, and Alan Dulles, John Foster's brother, as Director of Central Intelligence. The Dulles brothers, both with strong ties to Wall Street and a deep-seated anti-communism, were more receptive to the British proposal. In the early months of 1953, the United States and Great Britain began to lay the groundwork for what would become known as Operation Ajax. The plan was audacious: to overthrow the democratically elected government of Iran and install a pro-Western regime led by the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The task of orchestrating this audacious plan fell to Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a seasoned CIA operative and the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt arrived in Tehran in the summer of 1953 under the guise of a businessman. His mission was to assess the feasibility of the coup and, if possible, set the wheels in motion. He quickly established contact with pro-Shah elements within the Iranian military and political establishment, gauging their willingness to participate in the coup. Roosevelt found a willing partner in the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah, a constitutional monarch with limited powers, had grown increasingly frustrated with Mossadegh's assertive style and his attempts to curtail the monarchy's influence. With the Shah on board, Roosevelt began to finalize the details of the coup, working closely with his Iranian collaborators to choose a date and coordinate their actions. As Roosevelt and his Iranian co-conspirators plotted in the shadows, the political situation in Iran continued to deteriorate. Mossadegh, facing mounting pressure from the British embargo and internal opposition, had become increasingly authoritarian in his attempts to consolidate power. In August 1953, Mossadegh made a fateful decision that would seal his fate. He ordered the arrest of General Fazlollah Zahedi, a popular military leader and a staunch opponent of his government. Zahedi, tipped off about the impending arrest, went into hiding, but his arrest sparked outrage among his supporters in the military. With the stage set, Roosevelt gave the order to launch Operation Ajax. On August 19, 1953, pro-Shah elements within the Iranian military, backed by the CIA, stormed key government buildings in Tehran. The coup, swift and decisive, caught Mossadegh and his supporters completely off guard. The streets of Tehran, usually bustling with life, were eerily quiet on the morning of August 19, 1953. The tension in the air was palpable, a sense of foreboding hanging over the city. As the sun rose over the Alborz Mountains, groups of men, some in military uniform, others in civilian clothes, began to gather at prearranged locations. These were the foot soldiers of Operation Ajax, a motley crew of disgruntled military officers, paid thugs and religious zealots, all united by their opposition to Mossadegh. The signal to launch the coup came in the form of a coded message broadcast over Radio Tehran. Trucks loaded with armed men fanned out across the city, seizing control of key government buildings, newspaper offices, and radio stations. Pro-Shah slogans blared from loudspeakers, urging the people to rise up against the tyrant Mossadegh. The coup, initially met with confusion and disbelief, quickly gained momentum. Pro-Shah crowds, spurred on by CIA-funded propagandists and emboldened by the lack of resistance, poured onto the streets. They clashed with Mossadegh supporters who were caught off guard and outnumbered. Mossadegh himself, holed up in his residence, seemed paralyzed by the swiftness of the events. By the time he realized the gravity of the situation, it was too late. On August 22, 1953, after 3 days of street battles and political maneuvering, Mossadegh surrendered to the pro-Shah forces. The Shah, flown back to Tehran on his private plane, returned to a capital draped in his portraits and echoing with chants of Javid Shah, long live the Shah. The Shah, now firmly in control, wasted no time in consolidating his power. Iran, once a fledgling democracy, had become an authoritarian state ruled with an iron fist. Operation Ajax cast a long shadow over US-Iran relations. The coup, a blatant interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation, fueled anti-American sentiment among Iranians. The Shah, initially hailed as a savior by the West, proved to be an unreliable ally. He used the Savak to suppress dissent, imprisoning and torturing his opponents. His policies, though supported by the United States, further alienated the Iranian people. The seeds of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which toppled the Shah and ushered in an era of Islamic rule, were sown in the aftermath of Operation Ajax. The revolution, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was a reaction not only to the Shah's autocratic rule, but also to the perceived meddling of the United States in Iranian affairs. The hostage crisis at the US Embassy in Tehran marked the beginning of a period of hostility and mistrust that continues to this day. Operation Ajax stands as a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of foreign intervention. The coup, hailed as a victory for the West at the time, backfired spectacularly, destabilizing Iran, fueling anti-Americanism, and ultimately paving the way for the Islamic Revolution. The overthrow of Mossadegh, a democratically elected leader, undermined the very principles of democracy and self-determination that the United States claimed to champion. It also created a legacy of mistrust and resentment in Iran, complicating US efforts to engage with the country and address regional challenges. Operation Ajax serves as a reminder that regime change, even when undertaken with the best of intentions, often leads to unforeseen and undesirable outcomes. The lessons of Operation Ajax remain relevant today as the United States grapples with the challenges of a volatile Middle East and the unintended consequences of its past interventions.